Texas, Mr. Roy, for 30 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I want to thank my friend from Arizona for being willing to stand on the floor of the United States House of Representatives when, unfortunately, so many of my colleagues are not this evening to talk about the danger facing our country. And the gentleman outlines, if I believe I'm correct, that we'll be facing $112 trillion of debt come 2050 if we do not change course, if we do not take the steps necessary to make changes with respect to our health care spending and make wise policy choices. Like any family, any budget that you have to maintain if you're running a business, a nonprofit, a university, virtually everybody in the world, or at least everybody in this country, except for this body right here, that has to maintain and balance a budget and make determinations and make tough choices. If the gentleman would indulge me for a minute or two, for a couple more minutes on the floor, when was the last time, if the gentleman recalls, we've had the ability to amend a piece of legislation on the floor of this body? Truly amend it. Does the gentleman remember?
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
You know, brilliant question. And I cannot actually think of something that was substantive, where there was a collective idea from my brothers and sisters on the left and the right that there was actual intellectual battle here where we made something better. This place is functionally a intellectual dictatorship.
Would it surprise the gentleman that it was May of 2016, the last time that an amendment was offered on the floor of this body in open debate? Now, to be clear, that is an assessment of leadership in both parties. But how on earth can we actually solve the problems, I would ask the Speaker, if we don't come down and sit at this table and stop looking up at the C-SPAN cameras and just sit around this table and start with a budget, like any family or any business, and say, here's how much money we have, here's how we can responsibly spend for the betterment of the people, have disagreements about what those priorities are, and make choices. When was the last time that we've done that? It's a rhetorical question, but I know one data point is that May of 2016 was the last time that any member of this body was able to walk onto this floor and offer an amendment that wasn't pre-cooked up in rules previously and already set up by the leadership structure of either party. Would the gentleman agree that that is no way for the People's House to operate?
Will the gentleman allow me just a quick colloquy with him?
Yes, sir.
The process is broken. It's why I come here almost every week, and you do too, and we try to just focus on what's ahead of us. And look, you know, I just spent a half an hour sort of focusing on debt and deficit. That's not Republican or Democrat. It's what's ahead of us. You've been here a few years. How many actual real discussions, other than theater of we should do a study commission, we should write a strongly worded memo, the theater of this place, instead of doing what's really hard, and understand you can't just do one thing. That's the great fraud now. We've gotten ourselves in such a difficult position. It's got to be everything. You know, a couple years ago I came here and we brought in 19 attributes that you had to do almost at the exact same time to maximize enough economic growth, enough technology disruption, all the things to make it work. You actually helped me on some of that. But my fear, those are really uncomfortable, and you'll have an army of lobbyists really unhappy with you when you tell the truth about the math.
Well, the gentleman is completely correct, and there's no debate about that. You want to have a conversation about solving the Medicare crisis driving $112 trillion, then you have to have a conversation about solving the health care crisis. And to solve the health care crisis, you need to actually be willing, both sides of the aisle, to take on the army of lobbyists representing the insurance companies, the hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, all minting money right now, by the way, literally minting money. And you got to be willing to have a conversation about that, to actually figure out how we can transform our healthcare system to be patient-centered, doctor-centered, and not have to go to an insurance bureaucrat or a government bureaucrat to figure out what your health care looks like and then get competition, transparency, and drive down prices. Because if you drive down prices, we can actually solve the Medicare crisis.
The gentleman knows in many quarters I'm a bit of a heretic on this. I actually believe we're on the cusp of miracles. If it's true that we just found a cure for type 1 diabetes, if the math is true, about 1/3 of all U.S. healthcare spending is just type 2 diabetes. For my Native American populations, for my urban poor, for my rural Anglo poor, the amount of diabetes, the misery, the suffering, wouldn't it be one of the most elegant, noble things we could do is say, screw this noise we're doing. We're going to do our Operation Warp Speed. We see there's a stem cell to an islet, to the islet producing insulin. There is a path, but it requires intellectual discipline, telling the truth, and saying no to a lot of people who are going to be upset because a cure ends the misery. It also ends the manipulation.
Well, I would agree with the gentleman, and I hope that we can reach a point where, to your point, you asked me a question about how many times we had a real substantive debate. The closest I can remember was I made this point about amendments on the floor of the House, and the gentleman from Maryland, the leader, said in an agreement, yeah, I wish we had more debate on the floor, and I wish we didn't. Well, I'd say to the leader, well, let's do it, right? Let's start. Let's drop a bill on the floor instead of a 2,000-page monstrosity that costs X trillions of dollars, that was passed on rules, that's brought to the floor, that we then offer an MTR, and then we go give press conferences about why we can't support it. That's just no way to actually do the work of the people. Let's drop a bill here on the floor that starts with a shelf, like the NDAA last week. Let's just put a bill here on the table, and then let's offer amendments, right? We had a whole fight about draft our daughters, about vaccine mandates, all these things. Well, just start with the NDAA and then offer some amendments. Let the votes work. Let the people speak.
Chip, you're a heretic.
I am. I am.
Look, before I leave you, I'm still hopeful. I think there's a path that saves us. But the window for that escape is getting very narrow.
Shrinking.
The speed of debt accumulation, the unwillingness to deal with complex problems, with complex solutions, because that's reality, is closing fast on us. And the number of members who are like you, who are willing to come to the floor and say very difficult things that are truthful, they're becoming rarer. So,
well,
thank
I
you.
appreciate the gentleman.
Thank you for the colloquy, Chip.
Yes, sir. God bless you. I'll see you next week. And I appreciate your steadfast commitment to trying to speak the truth and come down to the floor and speak to the American people, and unfortunately, too often, an empty chamber. I appreciate that my colleagues, many of whom are able to get a flight and go home, and God bless them, but we have problems to solve. And we ought to be here debating in this chamber rather than posturing. I would note that previously, my colleagues were eulogizing and remembering Senator Bob Dole, who, as we all know, is a World War II veteran who was injured in combat. A man of great distinction who served in public life pretty much since his service in World War II. And he is a reminder, as we all know, of losing that generation. There are precious few remaining. Both of my grandfathers have passed who served in World War II. We lost Senator Dole this week. I was on a flight from Austin, Texas earlier this week on Monday with an honor flight with 8 veterans of World War II who came up for Pearl Harbor Day on December 7th. Now, none of those 8 had been present at Pearl. 2 of them were over 100 years old. One of the men, I sat next to him on the plane flying up to D.C., had served and been in combat in Iwo Jima. There's only a few of these folks left. And what I want to spend a minute focusing on as we're heading out, and I know we'll be back next week for a day, but we're getting close to winding down and heading home for Christmas. I want to remember what that generation did. A story from a couple of years ago. Joe Crute and Jim Swartz remembered vividly the merciless, frigid cold they survived during the Battle of the Bulge. Ice, wind, snow, frozen ground, frostbite, amputations, pneumonia, Americans dying from hypothermia in a land far away from their homes. Approximately 1 million Allied forces endured the inhospitable conditions during the fight that lasted from December 16, 1944, until January 25, 1945, a span which, of course, surrounded Christmas. This was the Germans making their last major offensive strike on the Western Front during World War II. Almost 90,000 of them ended up wounded, missing, captured, or dead from battle injuries. 77 years later, this was written 2 years ago, when recalling the bitter conditions at the Battle of the Bulge, Swartz stared at his large hands, rubbing them together as if trying to warm them. "I have something to show for it," he said, when sharing his experiences. "I have the results of that cold. My hands are almost to the place where they're useless from the frostbite." You couldn't drink the water from the lakes due to the fact of dead animals and dead bodies in the water, so we had to purify that. And some of the boys couldn't get to the water. Some of them, the water was frozen in their canteens. So what did they do? They ate the snow to keep their body liquefied. We attempted to make shelter in the ground, but to no avail. You tried to dig little holes in the ground to sleep. The ground was so hard, you couldn't dig a hole. So what you did is you got pine branches off of the pine trees, laid them down on the ground, and laid there and covered yourself up with half of your pup tent. That's how you tried to keep warm. One day, a fellow soldier was mortally wounded. He was a little bit bigger than I was, Crute said. He was shot in the back. I ran and got his Mackinaw off. It fit him perfect, but when I put it on, it was an overcoat. It felt good, and I pitied the poor guy, but it was so cold. At that time in 1944, there's the famous exchange that happened when the German commander wrote our commander, General McAuliffe, basically saying, "Battalions are ready to annihilate the United States troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term." General McAuliffe replied famously, "Nuts." And they fought on. They battled on. Many of the soldiers spent Christmas 1944 celebrating the best they could. American soldiers within Bastogne, Christmas services were held by the Army chaplain. Some in the country went and visited with others. One story, we were out in the outskirts of Bastogne. We found this farmhouse. Inside was a man and a woman, and a little boy and a little girl. The wife, she gave us some soup and some black bread. We stayed there all night in this farmhouse. The war was going on fiercely outside, and for some reason the farmhouse never got hit. We were there Christmas Eve. We sang Christmas songs that night with this Belgian family. We sang Jingle Bells and Silent Night. The words were different, but the music was the same. The thing that strikes me as we think about that generation, we think about what they did in World War II in response to Pearl and signing up and enlisting and going out into the Pacific and going into Europe to stand up against tyranny around the globe and defend our country, but also others around the world for an idea and for something bigger than they. They signed up without a question. And Churchill famously observed that once we were bombed by the Japanese on that December day in 1941, that caused then President Roosevelt to come into this room and give that famous speech about that day that will live in infamy. Churchill observed that the war would be won. The sleeping giant had been awakened because the world knew who we were. The world knew what America stood for. It knew that sleeping giant had been awakened. Now, nothing could be assumed. It took a massive ramp up, massive sacrifice, rationing, women enlisting to be Rosie the Riveter, men enlisting, going across, 400,000 dead represented on those stars at that memorial here on the Mall. But the world knew what we would do. The question I would ask my colleagues today: does the world know what we would do today? Does the world know who we are? Does the world know what we will do as we watch China on the rise, Russia rattling against Ukraine, Iran rattling about nuclear capability, and an unstable Middle East threatening our friend and ally Israel? Cartels and violence and unrest on our southern border. Does the world know whether we have the resolve to stand up in defense of the rule of law and in defense of freedom and against tyranny around the globe, but with the resolve necessary to win it? When President Reagan stood athwart the Soviet Union and talked about peace through strength and told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down these walls, the world knew our resolve. Do they today? And can we accomplish the objectives of defending this country and standing up in the world when we refuse to do the basic job of managing our own affairs in our own country responsibly? We amassed a mountain of debt in World War II, 125% of GDP by 1946, coming out of the Depression. But we got back and we got busy growing our economy, and we grew out of it and got that down. But we're sitting here today in relative peacetime with $30 trillion of debt, barreling towards $112 trillion of debt, as my colleague just articulately illustrated on the floor of the House to an empty chamber, minus myself and the Speaker. And we're doing nothing about it. Nothing. Literally. Just last night, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth among my colleagues because we dared force votes on 30 suspension votes. Oh no, we might miss a Christmas dinner or a Christmas party. Oh no, we might not catch our flight home early enough. $2.7 billion were authorized last night in suspension votes. All bills that often just sound good in the headline. 3 of us voted against a bill that would provide $500 million over 5 years to support research and funding for therapies for ALS. I was one of those 3 no votes. Do you think I want to go back and talk to people and families that are afflicted by ALS? But where are the rest of my colleagues in explaining where that $500 million is going to come from? Because when we're faced with a conflict like our forefathers were facing, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, when Hitler was on the march, and we resolved to fight, and we could, because our economy was strong enough, and we were disciplined enough to try to do the right thing, are we able to do that today? When we're not even disciplined enough to sit here and figure out how to manage the budget and the spending of the United States so that we don't drive our country into complete and total bankruptcy and destroy it for our kids and our grandkids? But literally everybody, both sides of the aisle, just goes, well, oh, there's just some votes. Some people today were giving me trouble because one of those suspension votes might be used as a political weapon by one of my Democratic opponents or one of our Democratic colleagues because they managed to pass some bill with a 375 to 40 bipartisan vote. Oh no, don't give somebody a political weapon so they can go run an ad. Nowhere was the concern about another $2 or $3 billion just passed through on suspension bills that we hardly debated. When we talk about and we venerate men like Bob Dole and serving in World War II, when we talk about and we look at our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers who sat there in the frigid cold or stormed Iwo Jima or stormed the cliffs at Normandy, can we fight those fights tomorrow? Are we capable of it? Do we have the resources to do it, much less the resolve? If we can't even resolve in this body to preserve and protect the actual foundation of this country to be economically and financially firm and stable. If we don't resolve the 435 members of this body to do the hard work, as my colleague from Arizona was pointing out, of making tough decisions about Medicare and Social Security and mandatory spending, but also the discretionary spending that I talked about last night, but also the National Defense Authorization Act that we just threw $25 billion at the Defense Department with no real reforms or changes to how they spend money. How are we ever going to save this republic? I said last week in a speech that this is the United States House of free stuff, because that's what it's become. It has become an entity that doles out money to whatever cause because it sounds good and it feels good. $500 million for ALS research. God bless them. I'm glad that research is going to occur. But someone's got to sit on the floor of the House and say, where are we going to get the money? Not just print it. I can't go next door to my neighbor and knock on the door and say, hey, it's time for you to give me your check. What check? Well, the check for ALS. Well, what do you mean? Well, it's a good cause. The check for cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. The check for polio. My dad's a polio survivor. Or whatever it might be. Not one of us in this chamber has the right to go next door and knock on our neighbor's door and say, give me a check to go give to another thing. You wouldn't do that. But through the power of this body as a whole, we print money, borrow money, and then dole it out for political benefit and nothing more. And it's cowardly, and it's embarrassing, and it's destroying the republic. Thread by thread, the flag is getting tattered because we refuse to do the hard work, as my friend from Arizona said, of making tough decisions to ensure that we can sustain this republic. We'll come back in next week. The debt ceiling will get raised. That is as true as the sun coming up in the east. And not a thing will be done to right the ship of the massive amount of debt piling up around the ears of our kids and our grandkids. Nothing will be done next week to solve that problem. Republicans will blame Democrats using a crazy procedural ploy in the Senate, passing a bill to blow up the filibuster to allow the debt ceiling in a supposed one-time basis to be raised with a 51-vote threshold so that they can go back to the American people and say, I didn't vote to raise the debt ceiling, but you did. Don't let them hide. They did. They concocted the scheme. They voted to make sure that that happened, and the debt ceiling will be raised. And not a thing will change about how we carry out our work. Nothing will be done to make this country fiscally sound again. Madam Speaker, may I ask how much time I have left?
5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. Take a minute to thank the staff, the floor staff. We come down here and we speak in the late hours. We have votes like last night that go to 9 or 10 o'clock because some of us forced some votes. Appreciate all of y'all's hard work. As a former staffer, I know it's not easy. The American people are a great people. The American people want this body and the Senate and their leadership in Washington to actually represent them again. I'm going to keep giving this speech over and over again, and I'm going to keep calling for this body to do the hard work of representation. We don't govern, we represent. Those men who sat in the freezing cold and frostbite and amputations and pneumonia and death and picking up jackets off of their fallen compatriot to stay warm, to defeat Hitler's Germany. Those men that responded to Pearl Harbor 80 years ago this week. President Washington overlooking this chamber here in that portrait, crossing the Delaware, Christmas Eve night, 1776. What will we do to honor their memories? What will we do to carry forward this republic that they fought, died, bled, lost limbs? Senator Dole carrying a pen in his crippled hand. What will we do to honor that sacrifice? That is our calling as we embark on the second half of this Congress. I don't accept that just because my party is not in control of this chamber for the next year, that we can't find a way to actually do the hard work of representation. My ask of the Speaker, the leader, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, my colleagues on this side of the aisle, restore regular order on this floor. Bring bills to the floor and allow us to vote, debate, amend, and do the work the American people expect us to do. It is the least that we can do to honor the memory of those World War II veterans who are losing by the day, and all of those who have sacrificed to defend this country, and all of those who sat there on that Christmas Eve day in Bastogne singing Christmas carols, hoping to get back to this great country. Let's fight to save that great country. I yield back, Madam Speaker.